Chapter 34, the second most painful thing you'll ever have to do. Winter sped relentlessly closer. At first, Rowan kept a tally of the lies he temporarily ended, but as the days passed, he found he couldn't keep up. A dozen a day, week to week, month to month, they all blended together. For the 8 months he trained under Scythe Goddard, he had made over 2,000 kills. Mostly the same people over and over again. Did those people despise him, he wondered, or did they truly see this as just a job? There were times when the training called for them to run or even fight back. Most were inept at it, but some had clearly been trained in combat. There were several sessions where his targets had their own weapons. He had been cut and stabbed and shot, but never so severely that he had to be revived. He had grown into an exceptionally skilled killer. "You have excelled beyond my wildest expectations," Goddard told him. "I suspected you had spark in you, but I never dreamed it would be an inferno." And yes, he had come to enjoy it, just as Scythe Goddard said he would. And just like Scythe Volta, he despised himself for it. "I'm looking forward to your ordainment," Volta told him one day during the afternoon studies together. "Maybe you and I can split off from Goddard, glean at our own speed and our own way." But Rowan knew Volta would never find the momentum to escape Goddard's gravity. "You're assuming that I'll be chosen over Citra," Rowan pointed out. "Citra's gone," Volta reminded him. "She's been off-grid for months. If she shows her face at Conclave, the Julian Committee won't look too kindly on her being AWOL all this time. All you have to do is pass the final test, and without question you'll win." Which is what Rowan was afraid of. The news of Citra's disappearance had trickled down to Rowan unofficially. He didn't know the whole story. She had been accused of something by Xenocrates. There was an emergency meeting of the disciplinary committee, and Scythe Curie showed up on her behalf, clearing her of any wrongdoing. The accusation must have been orchestrated by Goddard because he was furious at the committee's decision to drop the charges, and by the fact that Citra had completely vanished. Not even Scythe Curie seemed to know where she was. The day after that, Goddard took his junior scythes and Rowan on a gleaning rampage, fueled by his fury. He released his rage at a crowded harvest festival, and this time Rowan couldn't save anyone because Goddard kept him by his side as his weapons caddy. Scythe Chomsky used his flamethrower to set a corn maze ablaze, smoking people out to be picked off one by the other scythes. Scythe Volta was now in the doghouse, though, because he had lobbed a container of poison gas into the burning maze. Highly effective, but it stole kills from Goddard and the others. "I did it to be humane," Volta confided to Rowan. "Better than die by gas and fire." Then he added, "or by getting blown away just as you thought you were escaping the corn maze." Perhaps Rowan was wrong about Volta. Maybe he would escape from Goddard, but he certainly wouldn't do it without Rowan. It was one more argument for Rowan to earn the ring. They had all reached their gleaning quota by the end of that awful evening, and Goddard still didn't seem satisfied by his bloodlust. He raged against the system, if only to his own disciples, calling for a day when scythes would have no limits on gleaning. Citra returned to Scythe Curie at Falling Water many weeks before Winter Conclave, when the month of lights had just begun, and gifts were being passed between friends and loved ones to celebrate ancient miracles that no one quite remembered. Unlike her frantic journey to Amazonia's north shore, Citra flew in comfort and with peace of mind. She didn't have to look over her shoulder every 5 minutes because no one was chasing her anymore. As Scythe Curie had promised, Citra had been cleared of any wrongdoing, and while Scythe Mandela sent a heartfelt note of apology to Scythe Curie to give to Citra, Highblade Xenocrates made no such gesture. "He will pretend like it never happened," Scythe Curie told her as the two of them drove from the airport. "That's the closest the man will ever come to an apology." "But it did happen," Citra said. "I had to hurl myself from a building to escape it. And I had to blow up 2 perfectly good cars," Scythe Curie said wryly. "I won't forget what he did. And you shouldn't. You have every right to judge Xenocrates harshly, but not too harshly. I suspect there are more variables in play than we know." That's what Scythe Faraday said. Scythe Curie smiled at the mention of his name. "And how is our good friend Gerald?" she asked with a wink. "Reports of his death have been greatly exaggerated," said Citra. "Mostly he gardens and takes long walks on the beach." The fact that he was still alive was a secret they both planned to keep. Even Scythe Mandela believed that Citra was staying with a relative of Scythe Curie in Amazonia, and he had no reason to suspect it wasn't true. Perhaps I'll join him on the beach in 100 years or so, said Scythe Curie, but for now there's too much to do in the Scythedom, too many crucial battles to fight. Citra could see gripping the steering wheel even tighter as she thought of it. The future of everything we believe as scythes is at stake, Citra. There is even talk of abolishing the quota, which is why you must win the ring. I know the scythe you'll be, and it's exactly what we need. Citra looked away. Without daily gleaning, her training with Scythe Michael Faraday over the past few months had been honing her mind and body, but more importantly, contemplating the moral and ethical high ground that a traditional scythe must take. There was nothing old guard about it. It was simply right. She knew such high ideals were absent from Rowan's training, but it didn't mean he didn't hold them in his heart, despite his bloodthirsty mentor. Rowan could be a good scythe as well, Citra offered. Scythe Curie sighed. He can't be trusted anymore. Look what he did to you at Harvest Conclave. You can make all the excuses in the world for him, but the fact is, he's an unknown quantity now. Training under Goddard is bound to twist him in ways that no one can predict. Even if that's true, said Citra, finally getting to the point they both knew she'd been dancing around, I don't know how I would glean him. It will be the second most painful thing you'll ever have to do, admitted Scythe Curie, but you'll find a way to accomplish it. Citra, I have faith in you. If gleaning Rowan would be the second most painful thing she'd ever do, Citra wondered what the most painful thing would be, but she was afraid to ask because she really didn't want to know. So many of our archaic traditions and rules need to be challenged. The founders, as well-meaning as they were, still suffered from a mortal age mentality, having been so close to that age. They could not foresee the needs of the Scythedom. I would first take on the concept of a quota. It's absurd that we are free to determine our method and criteria for gleaning, but not the number of gleanings we accomplish. We are hamstrung every minute of every day because we must always consider whether we are gleaning too much or too little. Better to allow us to glean at our own complete discretion. That way, scythes who glean too little will not be punished, because scythes who have healthier gleaning appetites will make up for their shortcomings. In this way, we can help one another. And isn't helping fellow scythes a good thing for all of us? From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Goddard. Chapter 35, Obliteration is our hallmark. On the last day of the year, just 3 days before Winter Conclave, Scythe Goddard led one more gleaning expedition. But we've already reached our quota for the year, Scythe Volta was quick to remind him. I will not be constrained by a technicality, Goddard shouted. Rowan thought Goddard might actually hit Volta, but then he took a moment to calm himself and said, by the time we begin our gleaning run, it will already be the year of the capybara in Pan-Asia. As far as I'm concerned, that gives us permission to count our kills as part of the new year. Then we shall return in time for the New Year's Eve gala. Scythe Goddard decided it was a day for samurai swords, although Chomsky refused to part with his flamethrower. It's what I'm known for. Why mess with my image? Rowan had been on 4 gleaning expeditions with Goddard so far. He found he could escape to a place within himself where he was less of an accomplice, even less of an observer. He became the lettuce again, non-sentient and secondary, easily ignored and forgotten. It was the only way to keep his sanity in the midst of Goddard's blood sport. Sometimes he was so forgotten in the midst of the melee that he couldn't help people escape. Other times he had to be at Goddard's side, loading or switching out his weapons. He didn't know what his role would be this time. If Goddard was just using his samurai blade, he didn't need Rowan to be his weapons caddy. Still, he told Rowan to keep a spare sword. Preparations from the party were already in full swing as they got ready to leave for their gleaning run that morning. The catering truck had arrived and tables were being set up all over the grounds. The New Year's Eve gala was one of Goddard's few pre-planned parties, and the guest list was stellar. The helicopter landed on the front lawn, blowing away a tent that was being erected for the party as if it were nothing more than a napkin tumbled by the wind. Today we shall provide a much-needed public service, Goddard told them with far too much glee. Today we dispense with some rabble. But he didn't explain what he meant. Even so, as the helicopter took off, Rowan had a sinking feeling deep in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with their ascent. They landed in a public park in the center of a vacant soccer field lightly dusted with snow. There was a playground at the edge of the park where some toddlers, unfazed by the weather, climbed and swung and dug in the sand, bundled up against the cold. The instant their parents saw Scythe stepping out of the helicopter, they gathered their children and hurried away, ignoring their children's wails of protest. Our destination is several blocks away, Scythe Goddard told them. I didn't want to sit down too close and ruin the element of surprise. Then he put a paternal arm around Rowan's shoulder. Today is Rowan's inauguration, he said. You will perform your first gleaning today. Rowan recoiled. What, me? I can't. I'm just an apprentice. Proxy, my boy. Just as I allowed you to grant immunity with my ring, so will you glean someone today, and it will be tallied as mine. Consider it a gift. You don't have to thank me. But that's not allowed. Goddard was unperturbed. Let someone complain. Oh, what's that I hear? Silence. Don't worry, Volta told Rowan. It's what you've trained for. You'll do fine. Which is what Rowan was worried about. He didn't want to do fine. He wanted to be miserable at it. He wanted to be a failure, because only by failing would he know that he held on to a shred of his humanity. His brain felt about ready to burst out through his nose and ears. He hoped it would, because then he'd glean nobody today. If I must do this, I will be merciful like Scythe Faraday, he told himself. I will not enjoy it. I will not enjoy it. They came around a corner, and Rowan saw their destination, some sort of compound made to look like an old adobe mission, completely out of place in the cold of mid-America. The iron symbol atop the tallest steeple was a two-pronged fork. This was a tone cult cloister. Nearly 100 tonists reside behind those walls, Goddard announced. Our goal is to glean them all. Scythe Rand grinned. Scythe Chomsky checked the settings on his weapon. Only Scythe Volta seemed to have reservations. All of them? Goddard shrugged as if it were nothing, as if those lives meant nothing. Obliteration is our hallmark, he said. We don't always succeed, but we try. But this breaks the second command, and it clearly shows bias. Come now, Alessandro, Goddard said in his most patronizing tone. Bias against whom? Tonists are not a registered cultural group. Couldn't they be considered a religion? Rowan offered. You gotta be kidding, laughed Scythe Rand. They're a joke. Precisely, agreed Goddard. They've made a mockery of mortal age faith. Religion is a cherished part of history, and they've turned it into a travesty. Glean them all, said Chomsky, powering up his weapon. Goddard and Rand drew their swords. Volta glanced at Rowan and said quietly, The best thing about these gleanings is that it's over quick. Then he drew his sword as well and followed the others through a gated archway that the tonists always left open for lost souls seeking tonal solace. They had no idea what was coming. Word spread quickly on the street that a small elegy of scythes had entered the tonist cloister. As human nature would have it, rumor quickly raised the number to a dozen scythes or more, and as human nature would also have it, crowds that were slightly more excited than frightened gathered across the street, wondering if they would get a glimpse of the scythes and perhaps even the carnage they left behind. But all they saw for now was a single young man, an apprentice, standing at the open gate, his back to the crowd. Rowan was ordered to remain at the gate, sword down, to prevent anyone from escaping. His plan, of course, was to allow anyone to escape, but when the panicked tonists saw him, his sword, and his apprentice armband, they ran back into the compound, where they became prey for the scythes. He stood there for 5 minutes, and finally left his spot at the gate, losing himself in a maze-like compound. Only then did people begin to slip out to safety. The sounds of anguish were almost impossible to endure. Knowing he'd be expected to glean someone before this was enough to make it impossible for him to disappear. The place was a labyrinth of courtyards and walkways and illogical structures. He had no idea where he was. A building was burning to his left, and one walkway was littered with the dead, marking the passage of one of the other scythes. A woman huddled, partially hidden by a winter bare shrub, cradling a baby, trying desperately to keep it quiet. She panicked when she saw Rowan and screamed, holding her baby closer. I'm not going to hurt you, he told her. No one's guarding the main gate. If you hurry, you'll make it out. Go now. She didn't waste any time. She took off. Rowan could only hope she didn't run into a scythe on the way. Then he came around a corner and saw another figure huddled against a column, chest heaving in sobs, but it wasn't one of the tonists. It was Scythe Volta. His sword lay on the ground. His yellow robe was splattered with blood, and blood covered his hands, shiny and slick. When he saw Rowan, he turned away, his sobs growing heavier. Rowan knelt down to him. He clutched something in his hand, not a weapon, but something else. It's over, Volta said, his voice barely a whisper. It's over now. Clearly, however, from the sounds coming from elsewhere in the compound, it was not over at all. What happened, Alessandro? Rowan asked. Volta looked at him then, the anguish in his eyes like that of a man already damned. I thought it was an office or maybe a storeroom. I'd go in, there'd be a couple of people there. I'd glean them as painfully as I could and move on. That's what I thought, but it wasn't an office or a storeroom. It was a classroom. He broke down in sobs again as he spoke. There had to be at least a dozen little kids in there, cowering. They were cowering from me, Rowan. But there was this one little boy. He stepped forward. His teacher tried to stop him, but he stepped forward anyways. He wasn't afraid. And he held up one of those stupid tuning forks. He held it up like it would ward me off. You won't hurt us, he said. Then he struck it against the desk to make it ring and held it up to me. "By the power of the tone, you won't hurt us," he said. And he believed it, Rowan. He believed in its power. He believed it would protect him. "What did you do?" Volta closed his eyes, and his words came out in a horrible squeal. "I gleaned them. I gleaned them all." Then he opened his bloody hand, revealing that he held the boy's little tuning fork. It tumbled to the ground with a tiny atonal clink. "What are we, Rowan? What the hell are we? It can't be what we're supposed to be. It's not. It never was. Goddard isn't a Scythe. He may have the ring, he may have a license to glean, but he's not a true Scythe. He's a killer, and he has to be stopped. We can find a way to stop him, both of us." Volta shook his head and looked at the blood pooling in his palms. "It's over," he said again, and then took a deep, shuddering breath and became very, very calm. "It's over, and I'm over." That's when Rowan realized that the blood on Volta's hands was not from his victims. It was from Volta's own wrists. The gashes were jagged and long. They are made with very clear intent. "Alessandro, no, you don't have to do this. We can call an ambulance. It's not too late." But they both knew it was. Self-gleaning is every Scythe's last prerogative. You can't rob this from me, Rowan. Don't even try. His blood was everywhere now, staining the snow of the courtyard. Rowan wailed. Never had he felt so hopeless. "I'm sorry, Alessandro. I'm sorry. My real name is Sean Dobson. Will you call me that, Rowan? Will you call me by my real name?" Rowan could barely speak through his own tears. It's been an honor to know you, Sean Dobson." He leaned on Rowan, barely able to hold up his head, his voice getting weaker. "Promise me you'll be a better Scythe than I was." "I promise, Sean." And then maybe, but whatever he was going to say, it leaked away from the last of his life. His head came to rest on Rowan's shoulders, while all around them distant cries of agony filled the icy air. "Each day I pray as my ancestors did. They once prayed to gods that were fallible and fickle, then to one God who stood in harsh and terrifying judgment, then to a loving, forgiving God, and then finally to a power with no name. But to whom can the immortal pray? I have no answer to that, but still I cast my voice out into the void, hoping to reach something distant and deeper than the depths of my own soul. I ask for guidance and for courage, and I beg, oh how I beg, that I never become desensitized to the dust I must deliver, and it becomes normal, commonplace. My greatest wish for humanity is not for peace or comfort or joy. It is that we all still die a little inside every time we witness the death of another, for only the pain of empathy will keep us human. There is no version of God that can help us if we ever lose that." From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Verde.